If we don't think that the videos are going to come much more lifelike, then, well, we're naive beyond comprehension.
And isn't it funny, Topher, because one of the things we often hear in the United States is that we were a terrible country because in the past we judged people based on those immutable characteristics. But now we're doing the same thing.
But it isn't a free market at all when the government dictates the ratio of cars to be sold.
Welcome to the Aussie Wire News. Today we speak with David Cotter about the rapid weaponisation of deepfakes. They're not perfect yet, but that doesn't stop them from being abused. Then our science correspondent, Joanne Nova, joins us to discuss the Euro 6 emission standard. What is it? And why is it making our cars and our fuel more expensive? And finally, we'll catch up with North America correspondent Julie Harman to talk about United Airlines choosing pilots based on diversity and not merit. Yeah. That's going to end up on a brand new episode of Air Crash Investigations. All that is coming up right now on the Aussie Wire. Well, technology has advanced enormously, of course, over the last few hundred years. We all know that. But the rate of change, if anything, is accelerating. And the amount of change that we and our descendants will have to deal with is going to make what happened in the past look like child's play. One of the areas that's developing incredibly quickly is the area of machine learning, AI, and its close cousin or descendant, deep fakes. Deep fakes are getting better and they're being used in more and more creative ways. To discuss this increasingly significant issue with me, David Cotter returns to the Aussie Wire. David, thank you so much for joining us again.
Hello, Topher. It's good to be here.
Now, you in a past life, you worked a little bit on getting a robot to be able to play the guitar. From what I understand in that project, you ultimately abandoned it when you discovered that even robots insist on playing Wonderwall every single set that they play. Is that true?
You're a tease. I never said that at all. I won't come on this show again if you're going to be like that.
No, I am joking, of course, but you do have a background in technology and in the arts, and it puts you in a unique position to talk about this really interesting issue. For those that aren't aware of the catalyst, let me play you a video. And if you're watching this, just keep in mind, it is a deep fake. Please don't go rushing out there to hand over your personal information to scammers.
Hey y'all, Taylor Swift here. Due to a packaging error, we can't sell 3,000 Le Creuset cookware sets, so I'm giving them away to my loyal fans for free. If you're seeing this ad, you can get a free Le Creuset cookware set today. But just a heads up, there are a few rules.
It goes on, of course. Now, apologies for the little gaps in the audio there. I had to find whatever video I could online. It's been expunged from Meta, which is where it went viral. And this scam was apparently very effective. And apparently a very significant number of Swiftie fans were sucked in and went on to get to lose money and to lose information in that scam. David, what's your take on this?
I have many takes. I'm not too sure where to start. I mean, on the one hand, when I first saw it, I thought it was rather poor quality. However, a leading professor at the University of Buffalo came out and said that, called it a decent quality deepfake. And at the same time, he pointed to the fact that a video of that nature would only take 45 minutes to make.
Yeah.
So this is something we're going to see much more of. So my initial takes were this is poor quality, but it took a lot of people in. Mm-hmm. My other take was this is kind of funny in a way. I mean, I didn't wake up expecting to see a story unravel that had Le Creuset, a luxury kind of cookware brand with Taylor Swift and artificial intelligence wrapped up in one, but I did.
Now, to be clear, neither Taylor Swift nor Le Creuset had anything to do with that. That was a scam created by third parties using and really riding on the brand value of those two brands to try and suck people in. I tend to agree with you, David. I don't think that's a high-quality deep fake at all. And maybe I'm just a cold-hearted old codger, but there's a part of me that says if you got sucked in by that, you you kind of needed to in order to learn that lesson and maybe be a little more cautious in the future. There's a couple of things that really struck me that I'll mention, and then I'll quickly replay the start. They're very quick to cut away from Taylor Swift's image. They don't stay with Taylor Swift's face on the screen for very long. The lip syncing is terrible. There is no real relationship between her lips and the words that are supposedly being spoken. And the rest of the images are actually just ripped directly from Le Creuset ads. Let's have a quick watch again at the start of this. And these, for me, are all warnings, along with who's actually posted it. Has this actually come from a Taylor Swift official account, or has it not? Have a look.
Hey y'all, it's Taylor Swift here. Due to a packaging error, we can't sell 3,000 Le Creuset cookware sets, so I'm giving them away to my loyal fans for free. If you're seeing this ad, you can get a free Le Creuset cookware set today. But
What's
just
this?
a heads up, there are a few rules.
It's terrible.
You must live in the United States.
It just astonishes me that this, I mean, if it only took 45 minutes, okay, that changes things because the voice is reasonably convincing. But there are much more convincing versions out there. An example would be this one. It's fairly well known. I know you've seen this before, David. This video here that purports to be Morgan Freeman.
I'm not Morgan Freeman, and what you see is not real. Well, at least in contemporary terms, it is not. What if I were to tell you that I'm not even a human being? Would you believe me? What is your perception of reality?
And that there is the crucial question. Deepfakes are now on the cusp. If someone's willing to put the processing hours into it to make a good one, and that's an example of a relatively good one, not perfect, but very good, they can start to play with our perception of reality. Where do you see this going?
They're playing with our perception of reality, but also in the context of the Taylor Swift video. They're creating something that people want to believe to be true. And I don't succumb to this, but I feel the same way myself. Occasionally I'll receive a spam email bequeathing me, maybe not so many $1 million, but maybe a grand piano or something. And I think to myself, well, this sounds legitimate. What if it is legitimate? In a perfect world, maybe there is someone out there who's ready to bequeath me a Steinway grand. Yeah. And I think this taps into the cult of the personality, cult of celebrity. This isn't anyone giving away a freebie. This is Taylor Swift. This is the #1 streamed artist, listened to artist of 2023. To put that into context, she got streamed on Spotify 26.1 billion times last year.
Yeah, wow.
I mean, there are only 8 billion people in the world. Most of them don't have access to Spotify, the internet. And this is Spotify alone. We're talking about someone who is at the very top of the top. I mean, of all the artists on Spotify, only about 25,000 make something approximating a yearly wage. And as there are 11, 12 million plus artists in total, this equates to something like 1 in 500 people. I mean, Taylor Swift is queen of the world right now. And so even if 0.01 of her fans fall for this, those numbers are huge. So again, I mean, Morgan Freeman, he might not quite have the following of Taylor Swift, but he's still a phenomenal actor who we might argue will stand the test of time more than her. And I have seen deepfakes of figures that are bigger than both of them combined, especially when we get to the political sphere.
Well, you mentioned earlier in the interview that you weren't going to come back on because I was teasing you about Wonderwall. Well, you're definitely not going to come back on now because I don't mind a bit of a Taylor Swift marathon. I don't mind a lot of her music. And I do think, though, that my local radio station has put Spotify to shame and has probably played a Taylor Swift song a lot more than 21 billion times this year. It seems that they have her on relentless repeat. But it is interesting to think about the psychology of this sort of cult of personality because as much as they're getting a lot of attention because it's Taylor Swift, obviously deepfake Taylor Swift, ultimately the thing that they're offering, which to be clear, it wasn't real, it was a scam, but the thing that they were offering was the cookware. And the cookware is the same whether it's Morgan Freeman offering it or Taylor Swift offering it or me offering it. The cookware that would be, if it were legitimate, would be exactly the same. There's something about the psychology there that I find very interesting.
I mean, there was a degree of realism insofar as Le Creuset cookware has featured in the background of Taylor Swift's Instagram posts. She has featured them, not in a selling capacity, but they are visible on certain of her Tumblr posts over the years. So if you were I think some thought has gone into this, in that she's connected to the product in a roundabout way, as many people are. I mean, they've obviously, the brand itself, Le Creuset, has a certain degree of cultural capital. It's I don't know what it's like down under, but here in Europe, definitely they are definitely a kind of a symbol of, that's what you might call a middle class lifestyle. So the product and the person are tapping into a type of lifestyle that the consumer would want to inhabit. So that's how deep this thing goes.
Well, I can't comment on the UK situation, but I know here in Australia, if I go to someone's house and they are using Le Creuset, I assume they wipe their bottom with $50 bills. I mean, they must have a lot of money to burn. It's incredibly expensive over here. But there is a real dark side and a very, very serious side to deep fakes. And you mentioned the political sphere, and I've got an example here of exactly that. And this is where things can turn very, very dark. The video I'm about to show you is a deep fake.
Шановні захисники, бути президентом виявилося не так вже й легко.
Now what he's doing is he's telling
Я
Ukrainian
змушений
troops
приймати складні
to
рішення.
lay down their arms and to stop the
Спочатку
defense of Ukraine
я
against
вирішив
Russia.
повернути Донбас.
Now this, for me,
Настав час.
that's the danger. That's the real dark side right there, is the ability to sow discord and confusion into critical situations like a war.
Absolutely. And personally, I can only see this as becoming more of a problem. If we want to chart, let's say, using very broad brushstrokes here, the evolution, we have AI. What is artificial intelligence? Well, it's machines being used to mimic human behavior. Within that, we have machine learning. What's that? Well, it's machines parsing data and then coming up with new developmental models, algorithms based on that, to which a human can then look at and say, yes, that looks about right, or that looks wrong. And we go back and forth. Deep learning, situated within machine learning, situated within artificial intelligence, is when a machine passes the data, uses it to make predictions, then reflects itself in an almost human capacity, says, yes, this is realistic, or no, this isn't realistic. If it isn't realistic, it'll go back. It'll do the same again. So it's kind of self-improving. We can think of it in that way. So you can see just in these three simple steps that there's an acceleration of the technology here. So if we don't think that the videos are going to come much more lifelike than the Zelensky video you just showed me, then, well, we're naive beyond comprehension.
Well, misinformation and disinformation have been a genuine problem in politics since time immemorial, certainly in war. This isn't a new, even though we have everyone's talking about it because the government wants to regulate it and wants to have control over our speech using misinformation and disinformation as an excuse. The fact is, it does exist. It is a real thing. We saw, for example, during the Second World War with the Japanese surrender, there were a significant proportion of Japanese troops that did not believe the leaflets that got dropped over them. They thought it was American propaganda. And you can have some sympathy for that position because, well, why wouldn't the Americans drop leaflets and lie and claim that there's a surrender that hasn't actually happened? How do we live alongside each other? How do we navigate politics? Let's put aside war for a moment. How do we navigate politics when we're entering a world where not only will everyone have their own truths, but everyone is going to have their own very clear-cut evidence for those truths, and we're all going to be accusing each other of using and relying on deepfakes?
Well, there is a silver lining to all of this, and that is that I think people will be waking up to the very real reality of what is out there. The number of, let's say, psychopathic behaviors and people that fall prey to psychopathic behaviors in life is a relatively stable phenomenon. And what generally happens in cultures is that psychopathy, lying, scams, whatever you want to call these things collectively, they proliferate. And then it gets to a certain point where people become wise to this. People,
Sure.
batten down the hatches. People will start questioning everything they see. And I do believe this could go out one of two ways. Technology is going to have to be developed in new directions to circumvent this kind of human wariness, or they're just going to be ignored. At which point, people might become more relaxed again. There might be a new proliferation of, concerning deep fakery. But I'm afraid your guess is as good as mine.
Well, with respect to Shirley Bassey, it's all just a little bit of history repeating, isn't it? I mean, we have new technologies, but these are old problems, and I think you're absolutely right. We're going to have to go through that process. And maybe that buttresses my point. Maybe the Swifties needed to get swindled in order to become wiser and to become more wary of the increasing sophistication of these deep fakes. Well, David Cotter, thank you so much for joining us here on the Aussie Wire. We'll have you on again soon.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Speak soon.
Well, good news, everybody. The bureaucrats are at it again, saving us all from ourselves. As you know, petrol is quite an expensive thing, and these bureaucrats are so concerned about you and your cost of living and your wallet that they're going to make you drive more efficient cars, whether you like it or not, and whether you can afford it or not. This story comes to us courtesy of Joanne Nova, regularly here at the Aussie Wire. Jo, thank you once again.
Pleasure to be here, Topher, and this is such an important topic. Australians really need to understand what's coming.
Well, help us out, though, because what is coming? This doesn't necessarily mean a lot to people. Euro 6 fuel standards, what are we talking about here?
Well, we've seen a push in Europe and the US, and it hasn't made it to Australia, but it is about to. And what happens is they put these fuel emission standards on, which sound like a fine idea. Yes, let's make our air cleaner. But what it actually means, in effect, is that you won't get the choice of buying the car you want, and eventually you won't get the choice to keep the car that you want, and you won't get the choice to buy the petrol, the cheapest unleaded petrol that you want. And the rules coming out of Europe, and remembering Europe is far more densely populated, 600 million people effectively in the same space as what we've got in Australia with 27 million people. So air quality is a completely different issue there than what it is here. But we end up with a situation where you won't be able to run cheaply from place to place. You'll be buying more expensive petrol. And they're saying so consumers will be able to now buy European cars, and they mean expensive cars and EVs and things like that, they make out like it's such a win for consumers while they're denying consumers the right to do what consumers want. It's not a free market.
This strikes me as a bit of a let them eat cake moment, where they're sitting here and saying, aren't you lucky? We're going to adopt this latest standard that includes engines that are much more highly strung with much more narrow manufacturing tolerances and maintenance requirements and these sorts of things. I mean, there's a reason why these engines are more efficient. They require an enormous amount more engineering in order to be able to actually get them to operate in a way that can do this. As you've mentioned, they require more expensive petrol. And the government is basically saying, you now have to buy more expensive cars, whether you like it or not. You're welcome for us saving the environment. Is this just something that people are going to roll over and accept, do you think? Or do you think perhaps with the situation with the cost of living crisis that this might become a bit of a straw that breaks the camel's back?
Look, it all depends on whether Australians understand what's coming or whether they just see the headlines, because the media, of course, keeps reporting this as if it's just about emission standards. But what it's also doing in the immediate effect is making the government subsidies and discounts increase for EVs and decrease for hybrid cars. So where a hybrid kind of is the only EV that makes sense in Australia with our long distances, they're going to rule that out almost by cancelling some of the discounts on that and trying to force people into full EVs. I mean, this obsession with EVs is kind of hard to explain, given that EVs cost so much to build in terms of digging out all the minerals to make the enormous half-ton battery, and these minerals are coming from, child slave labor kind of conditions and whatnot. And by the time you look at all the energy put into an EV, you have to drive the thing for thousands of kilometres to even get back to neutral. So it's a very different, and plus, if you don't know if the battery's going to last that long, Will it ever get back to neutral?
That's right.
Especially if you scratch that EV and they have to write the whole thing off because there's no way to test whether the battery on a car which just got a scratch, no way to test whether that battery's not going to burst into flame 3 weeks afterwards. We can't do that yet.
You've done some great work on that, and I recommend everyone go to joannenova.com and check that out, because you've done some great work over a long period of time on that. We'll put a link to that in the description. One of the great points that's been made online here, and this is from Craig Kelly, Craig Kelly's X account. This is a headline from news.com.au, and obviously been modified with some pictures here. But this is directly going to affect people who are now buying what are the most popular vehicles in Australia. So this is not as though it's something that's going to affect people at the margins, a handful of people here and there. This is directly disincentivizing, and as you point out, will make far more expensive the most popular vehicles in Australia, for the purpose of pushing people across to vehicles that really aren't suited to Australia at all. Is this, do you think, a part of this? We're seeing bushland getting locked up, four-wheel drive tracks being locked up, hiking and rock climbing locations being locked up. Is this just a continuation of this idea that we ought to stay out of the natural environment and keep contained in our little cities?
Partly, but I think the big aim here is eventually to force everyone into EVs, and the reason for that is the digital cars. I think, as we talked about before, the fact that when you're in an EV, you can be tracked, traced. They can remotely stop the car. They can record your conversations. In fact, Subaru came out. A man reading the Subaru terms and conditions put a blog post up, which I put on my website the other day, that talks about how when you sit in a Subaru, so you don't own it, you're just a passenger, you effectively agree for them to own all of the information they get while you're sitting in the car. So they're recording conversations, they've got camera shots, face views, everything. It's all owned by Subaru. And we saw out of Germany recently, I think you remember, that an insider from the insurance, from a large insurance company, warned us that they were going to be selling this data, and that they were thrilled, the insurance company were thrilled that the EU had just made laws which gave control of that data. It took it away from companies like Subaru and gave it to the consumer, which sounds on the surface kind of good, except that when we know that the insurance companies and the government will probably then offer discounts to people who tick the box saying, yes, the government can have all my data. How fast am I going? Am I going to get a speeding ticket on the road while I drive today? Because the cameras, everything the car will be telling on me all the way. Obviously insurance companies want that kind of data. When an accident happens, they'll get a lot more information about who's at fault. But there's a huge privacy question here that people are not aware of. So, it's quite unnerving, their drive, this obsession with getting people into EVs. It certainly isn't for the environment.
Well, it's interesting because that privacy issue is already a very real one when it comes to smart TVs, Amazon Alexas and these sorts of home assistants, robot vacuum cleaners even. There are some very real privacy issues because, your TV, for example, if it is not even on, if it just has electricity to it, it is listening. Any device that can respond when you say, hey, Alexa, is listening to you all the time. And there's some very serious privacy issues around that. And we know that there have been instances where data has been being sent from people's homes without them really fully understanding the seriousness of that. And as you rightly point out, that's now beginning to happen inside what used to be one of the more private places. One of the more private places you could have a conversation with someone was on a long-haul road trip from the passenger seat to the driver. So that privacy is gone.
And Topher, just to expand on that, imagine the kind of conversations people used to have in cars when they thought they had privacy, and the kind of things they say. They might say their boss is having an affair or something like that. Now, that information in the wrong hands can end up being a blackmailable kind of thing, or it could be a market insider information. If someone's discussing something that isn't working well at the company or some trade deal they're doing. Now, if that information falls into the hands of hackers, adversaries, enemies, people who want to play the market and make money out of it, suddenly it is extremely valuable information, and it could do a lot of harm and damage to the idea of a free market, a free country, and everything else. So, people shouldn't think, well, I'm not doing anything wrong, this can't hurt me. Absolutely, it will hurt you, it will cost you. And if I can point out the what's happened in California and the EU, the really sting in the tail with this legislation is that eventually they start making rules where the government says to the companies, you can only sell, say, one internal combustion engine for every 2 EVs you make.
Yeah.
Now, the effect of that rule, and the government will say, see, we're not controlling the market. We're not deciding what people buy and what they don't buy. But they're forcing the EV companies or the car manufacturers to build EVs. They're forcing them to sell 2 EVs for every single ICE vehicle. So what happens? The price of the ICE, the internal combustion engines, has to go up because the companies have to limit the number of sales of these standard cars that we all love. And then they use the extra profits they make on those sales to discount the EVs. So what happens is a subsidy for electric vehicles. So eventually the poor will be able to afford electric vehicles, but the poor won't be able to afford internal combustion engines. And the internal combustion engine cars, that'll be something only the billionaires will be able to drive them out of the showroom sooner or later. You know, the ratio will be pushed. You'll be shifting until EVs are the common man's car. But as I said, you know, this is all subsidies for the super rich in a way.
But it always has been. You reflect on the idea, maybe perhaps someday the poor will be able to buy an EV, but I'm not so sure that they'll be able to afford to recharge it the way that electricity prices are going in this country. But subsidies are always a transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich. You think about subsidising an EV, even the way it has been done in the past. What we're saying is we're now going to take tax money off everybody, which includes mostly people who can't afford a new car, and we're going to give that to someone who can afford a new car, who by definition is already wealthier than the people we're taking that money from. That's always been the backbone of all of these schemes, is always a wealth transfer away from the poor towards those who are, comparatively speaking, relatively well-to-do.
Sure, and it's just an extra sneaky way of doing it, the way the government can kind of say hands off, well, we're not deciding who buys what car. Everyone still has free choice and there's still a free market, but it isn't a free market at all when the government dictates the ratio of cars to be sold. So what will happen is people who live in the inner city, largely the rich people in inner suburbs, will still be happy to buy an EV because EVs can work for them. And so they get the discount. And the people out in the country and the farmers and people in outer suburbs, they're the ones who have to fork out so much more to buy an internal combustion engine petrol car. And then they won't be able to buy the cheapest petrol as well. So, yeah, again, we get the poor and the outer suburbs subsidising the purchases of the people in the inner suburbs. So it's just crazy.
Last thought. We're talking about Euro 6 emissions. The word Euro is in there for a reason. These are decisions that are being made literally on the opposite side of the planet, where they have a very different geography and a very different population density, which you alluded to earlier. If you reflect on the fact that driving from the north of Italy to London is roughly equivalent to driving from Melbourne to Brisbane. It's a little bit further, but not by all that much. Whose idea was it that we should just take rules that literally have Euro in the name and just apply them over here and assume that that's just going to work out just fine for us?
Well, that's just it, isn't it? We find that kind of, and I don't like using the word globalist but there's no better word in a way to talk about that elite layer of multinational, international funding, the people with money spread across countries who seem to be pushing the same rules on every single country in the West. And of course, there's the World Economic Forum, the UN, the giant cartels of bankers, the BlackRock Vanguards, etc. All of these groups that seem to be above the rules, who also have an enormous pot of money to influence elections with in as much as they can, and who knows how that money sneaks its way into deals or job offers in the future. But strangely, every single country with its very different requirements is going to end up with almost the same laws. Kind of odd.
Food for thought. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but if you're paying attention... But
there is a pattern there, and it's time to admit the pattern is that we are copying legislation which looks like it was made by EU snobs and bureaucrats and dictated to us. And who knows, maybe 10 years from now, some members of our current government will get sweet jobs in the OECD or the IMF or the UN or...
straight onto the boards of car manufacturers, because let's be honest, what we're doing basically is saying, Australians, you're not allowed to buy the cars that are in your best interests. You have to buy the cars that are in the German manufacturer's best interests. And the German industry does need a lot of rescuing at the moment. It certainly does. They've made some very bad missteps. Look, Jo, that's all we have time for. Thank you once again. You're always amazing. Thank you for joining us on the Aussie Wire. I don't know about you, but any time I find myself in a life-threatening situation, the first question that I ask myself is whether the person who might be able to save my life was properly hired using the appropriate diversity, equity, and inclusivity criteria. Competence, of course, is secondary to making sure that we're being nice to each other. And someone who I'm sure wholeheartedly agrees with that particular perspective is our North America correspondent, Julie Hartman. Julie, how are you?
I'm good. You make me laugh, Topher. It's so true.
Well, but this is a story that you kind of have to laugh at, because we are literally, I'll play the video. For those that don't know what I'm referencing, we're talking about the doubling down of the American Airlines leadership on DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusivity requirements for their pilots. Have a listen.
Military. How is diversity and diversity targets working into the Aviation Academy? We have committed that 50% of the class of the classes will be women or people of color. Today, only 19% of our pilots at United Airlines are women or people of color. And by the way, from all the data I've seen, that's the highest of any airline in the country. White males don't just dominate in the cockpits, also in the C-suite at United Airlines. Well, look, at United, I'm proud of the diversity that we actually have in our C-suite. I think if you look around corporate America. Correct me if I'm saying, though, so this was just based off your website, the people you list as executives, but out of 11 people, 3 are women. I believe 1 is a person of color. That's correct. But, in corporate America, I think, That's a low bar. How do you raise your own bar? Well, a lot of this is, focusing on it. We have programs.
Notice that slight element of almost apologizing for the fact that there was only 1 person of color, as though that's the criteria based on which you should be picking your C-suite. These are the people that lead your company and are ultimately responsible for your safety record. Julie, is this the right direction that the great country of America should be going in?
No, this is absolutely not the right direction. And let me start off by prefacing my statement that's saying, of course, diverse people can be, and of course are, qualified to perform any job. I mean, we see that here in the United States. We have an incredibly diverse country. We've had a Black president. We have 2 Black members of the Supreme Court, 5 women out of 9. We actually have the most diverse Congress that we've ever seen in our history. Over a quarter of the United States Congress is non-white. And so I just wanted to say that out front, because what people say, when they oppose you, they go, oh, well, are you implying that, people who are ethnic or racial or sexual minorities can't be? It's so asinine. So I just wanted to get that out of the way, lest we be called a name topher. But no, this is not the right direction that we should be heading in as a country. What we should be doing is prioritizing excellence and meritocracy. That is what has allowed America to ascend to become one of the greatest countries on earth. That has been our ethos. Our ethos has been that we don't judge people based on their immutable characteristics, as a great civil rights leader, Martin Luther King, urged us to do, or to not do. But we judge them on the content of their character and on their merit, which people of all backgrounds can competently show. So I think that this is sadly prioritizing immutable characteristics. And isn't it funny, Topher, because one of the things we often hear in the United States is that we were a terrible country because in the past we judged people based on those immutable characteristics. But now we're doing the same thing.
Yeah, it is. It's all just a little bit of history repeating, as Aretha Franklin would have said. What I find particularly interesting about this is that there is a flip side to everything. If you promote someone who hasn't quite earned their way there on the basis of other characteristics, nothing to do with their competence, then that means that someone else who would otherwise have got that position, someone else who was competent, is now missing out on that position. Which means, by definition, the overall quality of people that you have in those positions is going to decline. The minute you introduce any criteria other than merit. And exactly like you, I've got no issue if my pilot is a woman or a person of color or any of these other things. I just want them to have been the person who was best for the job. That's my only criteria when my life is on the line. So what we're actually doing here is quite literally risking safety in return for virtue signaling.
Oh, absolutely. And I think what's so fascinating about this story is that it's indicative of a kind of broader situation here in the United States. We're all across the board, whether it's in hiring or gaining admissions to universities or the actual content that is taught in schools, we are focusing on intersectionality. We're focusing on race and gender as opposed to merit, or in the case of schooling, teaching people actual skills and actual subjects. I just want to tell you quickly that the US puts out this what's called a nations report card every few years that tracks test scores here in the United States. In last year, in 2023, only 13% of eighth graders met proficiency standards for United States history.
Wow.
Less than 20% scored proficiency levels in civics, and also, average math scores for eighth graders dropped 8 points from 2019, 8 points. And so what happened in that period? Well, of course, the pandemic, people were sent home from schools, but even the bigger thing is that all of these woke diktats has been suffused into these school curriculums. I had a ninth grade listener on my show, Timeless with Julie Hartman, send me one of his curriculums in his class, in his ethnic studies class, and he's not learning anything. All he's learning about is race and gender and trigger warnings. So again, I think this United story is part of a greater obsession we have in this country with immutable characteristics, when we need to be focusing on doing our jobs, hiring good people, and teaching people what they ought to learn.
It's actually takes me back to a headline that we had here in Australia, and I'm not making this up, but someone passed away with COVID, and the headline quite literally said, this person has passed away with COVID, but luckily they were vaccinated, or it would have been worse. And just the absurdity, right? And I just can't wait for the headline of, commercial airliner flies into the side of mountain, but luckily the pilot was a minority, or else it could have been worse.
I know. Well, you know what? Sadly, it's going to have to take situations like this in order to have people wake up. And I wish that it didn't have to be so dire, but to your point, it is.
Well, it's extraordinary times, and there is a sense for me that people have it's almost become a religion. People abandon any kind of sense or their own rationality in order to virtue signal and to appear to be good in this religion. But I'm quite heartened by the fact that increasingly we're seeing a bit of a cultural pushback. There are comedians now that are calling it out all over the place. There are some companies that are beginning the pendulums are beginning to come back the other way. We saw Victoria's Secret, of course, went very woke for a while there, and their sales plummeted, and now they're trying to backtrack. They're trying to come back a little bit. But also satirists, and satirists are wonderful people that give us a great gift every time they write a headline like this. I absolutely love this. Screwdrivers are now permitted on Boeing flights to allow passengers to help with maintenance. And this is, of course, reflecting on some of the poor safety records that have been happening recently around the world. Speaking not so much of the aeroplanes, but of the cultural side of things, to what degree do you think the fact that people like you have been speaking out on your show in Australia, the Aussie Wire have been speaking out, people like The Shovel satirising, to what degree is this having an impact, do you think, in helping to move this pendulum back in the right direction?
Oh, I think it's having a huge impact. I think sometimes we conservatives or we rational people here in the United States get too serious when we're, arguing about these issues. And of course they are serious, but at their core, they are absolutely absurd and ridiculous. And so I think that it's helpful to kind of laugh and just call out the absurdity for what it is. But again, I think the really important point here is that there is this greater theme of focusing, obsessing with immutable characteristics. And to laugh for a moment, I mean, when people are talking about, prioritizing gay people, for instance, in hiring or in, gaining admission, I always kind of take a step back and I go, why are people so obsessed with who others sleep with? Like, isn't that kind of absurd? Like, why are we judging people? Why is that diversity, what people's private decisions are and who, they choose to love and marry and spend time with? So yes, the whole thing is totally absurd, and you got to laugh so you don't cry.
Well, I've said for a long time, and it's gotten me into trouble a few times, but I'll say it again. If your sexuality is the most interesting thing about you, you are not an interesting person. Yeah. I don't care what it is. You are not an interesting person. Julie Hartman, let's hope that we're not coming on with a story about a plane flying into the side of a mountain anytime soon, and that we do see a bit of common sense on this. Any final thoughts before we sign off?
Nope, just hoping that it doesn't happen, but I'll keep looking at the news and we'll be talking about it here.
Julie Hartman, North America correspondent, thank you so much for joining us on the Aussie Wire. Thank you for watching the Aussie Wire News. We release new episodes of the Aussie Wire every Tuesday and Thursday at 4 p.m. Catch up on past episodes at theaussiewire.com, follow all our socials via @theaussiewire, and become an insider via the link in the description. I'm Topher Field, and this is the Aussie Wire.